بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Welcome back, everyone, to our continuing series, History in a Time of Genocide Between Palestine and the World, with Dr. Ariel Salzmann. I'm your host, Adnan Hussein, and we are midway through our series. We had 3 previous episodes covering 4 main topics that took a global and regional historical approach. So the frame has been really a kind of wide frame, and today we'll be talking a little bit more closely connected with events starting around the period of the Nakba and the establishment of the State of Israel, and going forward from there. Up to this point, we've been looking at a broader and longer history, about the long history of anti-Semitism, persecution and exclusion of religious minorities, looking at the emancipation projects of the 19th and early 20th centuries and their limits and failures, and of course also the topic of refugees. Maybe you might want to say a little bit about what you think the main key points out of that were, and welcome back, Ariel.
Thank you. I think you've covered much of it, and and as we were discussing, and I think I'm taking your words from you, there's a sort of failure of imagination to think about other pasts that were, experienced. They weren't counterfactuals. They were right alongside Europe, in which Jews fared, among other non-dominant groups, fairly well within an Islamicate societies. And the particular trajectory of emancipation within these major Islamicate societies, including the Ottoman Empire, led to unique formulations in the aftermath of World War I, which were never realized, which were sabotaged by the West. And the second point, again, that following on you, that these projects of emancipation not only were West and East, and on the other side of the Atlantic, but they had consequences for people, for all sorts of people, including African Americans, who experienced the backlash against emancipation, and were also forced to migrate. There's the Great Migration from the South in the face of terrorism, the KKK, and so Jews and Blacks have that experience, and Muslims did earlier in European history. And so the next topic we discussed was actually about these global flows of migration. The 19th century was characterized by these flows of migration, and a lot of them persecution, famine, economic insecurity,
War.
from all over the world. War, of people moving all over the world. And this reached a crescendo before and after World War I, and would continue in the interwar period as fascism spread in Europe and was targeting certain communities, Jews foremost among them, and the failure of Europe and the West to rescue European Jewry. When they had the opportunity, they couldn't reach everyone, but they basically told European Jews, you are not wanted. You're not wanted in Europe, in your homes, and you're not wanted in Canada, and you're not wanted in the United States. So this vice that Jews were put into was basically the reason why, in the end, Zionism as a project of a minority would become successful after World War II. Because still after World War II, Europe didn't want the Jews, didn't want the survivors. And over half of them ended up going to a state that would be formed by consensus of Western powers, as basically a form of reparation on other people's backs, not by, eventually Germany, of course, would pay financial reparations, but the territorial and security reparations for the Holocaust were paid by the Arabs and the Palestinians in particular, which again triggered, and we'll start there with another mass migration. So, one, failure to address inequality, prejudice, and the mass displacement and dispossession of one people will lead to the mass expulsion and dispossession of another people.
Indeed. Well, so that's where we should probably begin. I don't know if you want to give any further background. One theme or issue that we mentioned, but maybe we could have talked a little bit more extensively about it, and especially its consequences, is, of course, the era of colonialism and
Right.
empires. And, of course, the uh, episode we're speaking about is the culmination of, the end of the British mandate, French colonial mandate in the region, after the end of the Ottoman Empire in World War One, and so that interwar period where the rise of fascism, is happening in Europe, is corresponding as well to, settlement taking place, and the refugee, problem and question taking place. And so there might be something, as part of the background to think about settlement in the region, the colonial context in which much of this happened and was facilitated, and perhaps also a little bit about what kind of a movement Zionism was. And I know you have a kind of different way of framing and thinking about Zionism. And so maybe we might start there, and then we can get into the displacement of the Palestinians through the Nakba.
Yes, I mean there's two ways to look actually at World War One. It's a intra-colonial war. Germany trying to expand in the Caribbean, trying to expand in North Africa, clashing with the established powers, trying to expand further east. They had their sights set Afghanistan, beyond, and of course an alliance with Muslim powers during the war. So colonialism was very much in the mix, and the Ottoman Empire being the subject of colonial projects going back actually to the 18th century. The French were floating ideas of dividing the Ottoman Empire and parceling it out. And of course, their eyes were set on Palestine. So Palestine was the center of those colonial projects, going way back into the early modern period. Um, and it's in those processes that a very secular Jewish journalist who saw, as we talked about, the Dreyfus affair unfolding, which was a signal that Jews could not fully realize their rights and integration as they wished into these supposedly emancipating societies, came up with a formula that brought together these various strands. Settler colonialism. He was not, and I mentioned this, he was not a religious Jew. He was very much for assimilation. The project was modeled on the European West. I mean, it was justified. You just have to read, the Jewish State to see how he framed it. The hope was that Jewish colonization would be facilitated by a West that was already in the business of colonizing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so those two things came together before and during World War One, when the possibility, which Herzl and other Zionists had already reconciled themselves to, namely that Jews could not be induced to go to any place except for Palestine, where they had distant theological, emotional ties, but which the majority of world Jewry had not lived in for thousands of years. I mean, the whole concept that there was an indigeneity, which is now being touted, is just, ridiculous. And even Herzl realized it, because he was in favor of Argentina, Uganda, and other places that Europeans were already colonizing. And said, but realized that wouldn't be a selling point for the majority of Jews. So basically putting together the failed emancipation in Europe and saying, okay, you don't want us? Well, we can realize a society elsewhere. And he even says stuff like, well, once we're gone, they'll like us even more, they'll miss
I
us.
think that's actually an important point, because I think one of the alchemical transmutations of this nationalist movement of settler colonialism during an era when, at the apex and zenith of European colonialism around the world, they'd had
Victorian,
the Berlin
yeah.
Conference and, had divided up Africa and established new settler colonial projects there in the continent of Africa. And there had already been, recent history, of course, going back to the early modern period, your period of, settler colonial projects, in the Western Hemisphere, and then subsequently in, Oceania. And so it was fitting in within that paradigm. But the transmutation that's interesting or important here is how to convert from being the hated, marginalized, despised, oppressed object of this, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic hatred for millennia that we've already also discussed and talked about, was to actually be a colonizing settler community outside of Europe, like many of the others who had
Right.
left
And
Europe.
part
They
of
were
this
oppressed or
notion,
suppressed groups,
yeah,
like
this
the
part of
Puritan.
this culturally civilizing mission, that
That's
they
right.
would be
Yeah,
the outpost, and Herzl says that they will be the outpost of Western civilization, not Eastern civilization, not Jewish civilization, but Western civilization. So, this thoroughly European project, that had very little to do, that was grafted onto sentimental theological Zionism and that made of it something totally new, had some traction among elites. It had some traction among disaffected, especially in areas where Jews were still feeling a lot of prejudice. But it had very little general traction until World War II. So I think, again, we have to back up from this teleological notion, which, to tell you the truth, Israeli and Zionist historiography promotes, which is the idea was born in the 1890s. They didn't want us. It was a brilliant idea. It was fair. Jews were indigenous someplace else. We got that message. We accepted it. And we succeeded, and it was this straight success because it was right and it was just and it was something that Jews responded to. They didn't. They didn't. There were, full scale conflicts. If you had asked my great grandfather, he said in Slovakia, in his little shtetl, he said, "You cannot even be a Jew in the United States." He said, "I won't come." Judaism for most Jews was rooted in where they were in their communities, as most people live religions. They don't live religions in this big, in a nation state. They live religions in communities, and in very discrete locales. And it takes, different forms, those religious expressions. So, the great tragedy of European Jewry, which is the Holocaust, um, will sadly be the way that Zionism is eventually consolidated. It's that tragedy, but it is not inevitable. It was not inevitable, and nor was it inherently just or inherently fair or even inherently Jewish
hmm
in its
hmm
nature. So I
Well,
think
that's
that's the
something
other
we
thing
may
to
get into, and
disabuse
of course,
ourselves of.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that does go back to the point about early Christian Zionist thinking in Protestant communities and groups, and then of course we may be coming back to this issue as well
yeah.
later.
Well, later,
Right,
yeah.
but I think it's worth talking at this time about the context of the British Mandate and the forging of. What happened basically at the end of World War II, and covering this period with the foundation of the State of Israel and the consequences of this ethno-nationalist settler colonial project, and its logics over the coming period of history. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit
Yeah,
about
I'll
how.
pick up World War. Yeah, I'll pick up from World War One.
Okay,
We
great.
talked about the Lausanne and how it basically defeated whatever minimal gains had been made for minorities living in these new ethno-national states that were created on the Wilsonian model, and that failed so miserably in the interwar period, and of course would be absorbed in a racist, fascist system that expanded from Germany. But in the meantime, they World War I produced another inequity. The Arabs who had fought alongside the British were denied their own states. Their efforts to create a multi-religious, equitable type of participatory democracy were undercut, were destroyed. And in their place, although this Southeastern Europe had its national sovereignty reconfirmed by World War One. I mean, the Greeks was already there, Serbia was already there, Bulgaria had already declared independence, Romania, etc. But as far as the rest of the Ottoman Empire, and many of those countries were, of course, former parts of the Ottoman Empire, the Middle Eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire were completely denied self-determination. And instead, within, of course, during the war, France and England had already sat down with a map and divided it up into what they hoped would be their colonial rewards from World War One, because the Ottomans were on the side of the Germans and the Austrians, and the result was, to their great horror, the Arabs found themselves before complete betrayal of what they had fought for and what they had assumed. And of course, this notion that the Arabs and Muslims generally were unfit for self-rule, whereas Christians, Southeastern Christians, could rule themselves, with a little help on the, in terms of the minority treaties. So what would happen is these mandatory system
And of course, you're
mandates were
referring
formed.
first to the Sykes-Picot
The first
agreement
thing was the
between.
Sykes-Picot Agreement, but in 1922, as part of the Leeds Charter, they designated the Middle East, the Muslim Middle East, as a series of mandates that would be overseen as, and they were called mandates, not colonies, but they were effectively colonies. Um, and it was supposed to be the civilized states of France and England who were supposed to lead them tutelary in a tutelary role to future independence. So Syria is separated, Syria, Lebanon, and then Iraq, Jordan. The east of the Dead Sea is carved out, and Jordan River. And then Egypt remains under basically British rule of different forms. First, more direct, and then under, again, their sort of vassal, the king, the khedivs of Egypt. As for Palestine, there was yet another compromising factor, and that was the Balfour. The same Balfour who had opposed admitting Jews to England was now fervently, in favor of creating a Jewish homeland, especially after World War One, when there was new waves of Jewish refugees in Palestine itself. And the condition in the Balfour Declaration, of course, was not just to admit Jews, but also supposedly to protect the interests of what they recognized then, and what we should recognize now is the truly indigenous population, which was the Palestinian Muslim, Christian, and smaller numbers Jews who were already settled there. But that would open the floodgates to immigration. And all this time, and I think in a lot of the ways, the sort of popular ways of thinking about why Palestinians didn't welcome these newcomers with open arms, one has to remember that this had been going on since the 1890s, that Zionists had not been shy about telling them what their plans were, and were very well organized. And as I mentioned, I think in the last episodes, they were also very determined to set up an economy apart, an economy, a society, labor, Jewish labor only, Jewish goods only. They had no intention of integrating in any way, shape, or form with a society which, of course, many of them, carrying over the European mentalite, thought was inferior in any respect to theirs. So this whole situation under the mandate, is ripe for conflict, and conflict happens at various levels. There's much uh, uh, peaceful protest, and these include women's marches and women's delegation. Muslim and Christian women get together and speak to one another and oppose unlimited, unregulated migration, especially as you approach the Depression, when a tiny country under occupation by a foreign power is asked to absorb almost as many migrants as United States or some other country. So this produces conflict and eventually a full-scale revolt between 1936 and 1939, a peasant popular revolt that really engages the British. I mean, they're forced to transfer over all sorts of battalions, even as they realize, you're approaching World War II, that a bigger war is on the horizon. And it's in that period that they engage. The British drop all pretense of being an honest broker and basically bring in Jewish militias, train them in modern military means, arm them, and they, back them up during this popular war. These Jewish units are very much engaged. And when I teach the course, generally I say the Palestinian cause, forget about 48 through 49, the Palestinian cause was lost in 39. It was crushed in 39. It's very hard to mobilize a population 10 years later for a massive war. I mean, you know, hundreds of people were killed, they were hung, they were detained, all the full range of horrors that we see happening, under Israeli rule were taught to them by the British. House demolitions, detention without charges, of course, torture,
Interrogation and
yeah,
torture, yes.
interrogation, assassinations, So all of this happens in that window of those 3 years, and the British pull out the stops in order to crush that rebellion, and they do with Jewish help. Although no more Jews are coming in, those Jews who are there, many of them, not all of them. I mean, you can only read Edward Said's biography, and he talks about the warm relations that he, as a family, had with some of the newcomers. He had a Jewish doctor, and he was very fond of him, and his family relied on them. So you have this militant core that's now, well armed, and they are prepared for the war. They're prepared. They actually fight during the war in what they try to make as Jewish battalions under the British. And so they get all this military training, they get military hardware. They're already segregated themselves off from Palestinian society and militarized their settlements. And so by the time the war starts ending from the 40s onward, they are focused on one goal only: establishing a state in the immediate aftermath of the war, and that takes precedent over everything.
Right, and it's in that context that conflict arises themselves sometimes with the British authorities during the course of the war. So after they had already become trained, armed, organized as adjuncts to British colonial administration and suppression of the Arab revolt, in the subsequent years when Britain is fighting in World War II, and there are some impatient groups, that want to try and take control and establish the Jewish state as soon as possible, that there are some conflicts that emerge there. And that is often kind of characterized to try and deny in certain historiographies that the British had done everything in the intervening years in the late 20s through the mid to the mid 30s to enhance, the Jewish organized Zionist presence, and favor those groups and help them build these organized institutions that could be armed and then be very successful in prosecuting war as settlers against. And in fact, actually, I think it's interesting and important to think about that in the context of other emancipation projects, since we've talked about it, in the past, in the 19th century, and of course, starting with like some people would say American Revolution, the Bolivarian revolutions, and of course, you have to also look at Ian Smith in former Rhodesia. There are a lot of settlers who want to break away from the imperial center in their colony and declare themselves an independent and free republic because they don't want, at a certain point of their development, to deal with the limitations that the metropolitan center might impose for its own broader geopolitical and economic interests. They want to pursue their own settler colonial condition. And so you have these violent reactions. You had it in Algeria when they felt, that the French government was not supporting the Pied Noir, the Algerian settler, French francophone settler populations in Algeria, in their colonization efforts. And so I think that's the way to look at that. But it's often framed as, this is a case where clearly you see the British were actually suppressing the Jewish state. They didn't facilitate it, and had to be won against the British as well. And I think that's important.
Well, I think there was a change in British attitude from the 30s onward. So I think
of course there was, but that's what I was
transition.
saying.
But as far as, the difference with, I think, other settler colonial projects, in the sense, even the American Revolution, is that the American settler colonists did not go there with the intent of creating a state. So
so
that was a
through
line.
Yes.
And that, took precedent over many things. And, it's another whole discussion about, Zionists during the Holocaust. Could they have done more? What happened, etc. So that was the through line, that everything was going to be worth it for the sake of creating this state. And by the 40s, of course, in some cases, and it's interesting how many of these early Zionists they fought in the Ottoman army. Ben Gurion did a law degree in Istanbul. They were thoroughly immersed, but they kept the quote unquote eyes on the prize, not to misuse that quote, but that's what they knew where they were going, and they worked with the Young Turks. They worked with the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress. And as well as the Germans during World War One. So they had an idea of, how, and they ignored the Armenians, the plight of the Armenians. And there's studies on that up to the present day, about the Armenian genocide in Israel. So there was a very focused cadre who were already fanning out, knew exactly what they were doing, were ready to set aside all sorts of moral compunction. And when the moment came in the 40s, when in the aftermath of World War II, the British or French are already, their energies have been sapped by the war. This was the perfect moment to make the move. And I think in a policy that repeats itself over and over again, the sort of brinkmanship, the sabotage of peace, this becomes the policy and the modus operandi of these Zionist zealots, who are out to build, no matter what, at what cost, this state. And they do so, we can blame the, extremes, the Jabotinsky revisionist extremists, but they were also so-called the mainstream labor, who were very much involved in these kind of acts of terrorism. And they would go on to become, prime ministers and presidents of the state of Israel. And no one blinked at that after the war. I mean, the British were a little bit appalled when Netanyahu decided he was going to commemorate the anniversary of the bombing of the King David Hotel, which took the lives of many British, many Palestinian Muslim Christians and Jews, and destroyed a sort of civic space for all peoples that was created by Egyptian Jewish capital. They were appalled by that. I think it was in 2006 or something, that Netanyahu sort of, praised that event.
Right.
Yeah, the British were like, what? But, they did this sabotage to sabotage peace and for maximalist objectives. And you see this time and time again. And although you can blame the extremists, for some of the most spectacular and horrific, they serve the general cause in pushing forward this agenda, especially in this moment in the post-war period when the scale of the Jewish slaughter, the slaughter by the Nazis of Jews, and of course 6 million Jews and 6 million uh, people, people who are gay, people who are disabled, gypsies, other racial minorities were destroyed, Slavs put into forced labor camps, yeah, Romani and Sinti. So, in this aftermath of the war, it became the moment in which these plans that they had been nurturing and had maneuvered very successful maneuvering. And I think a lot of that had to do with, is that integration into the Western uh, mindset, into the Western political systems. I mean, it always struck me, in seeing how difficult it was for Middle Easterners and as comparison to Latin Americans who could talk in a language to North America, to U.S. and Europeans in a different way. How that integration into that political system and cultural system facilitated their ability to manipulate politics, win alliances, and support, and that will be the technique that Israel's leadership will deploy up until the present day.
Yes. And so the actual establishment and foundation leads to displacement of many Palestinians and the birth of a new refugee problem. You're pointing out that, of course, the goal was to establish an ethno-nationalist exclusivist state. That was always the intention and the goal. And I think, it's become clear from subsequent analysis and scholarship that the goal was to try and take as much of the land and as few of the people. There might be some need for some population to be a subordinate laboring class, and so on, for industry and so forth. But by and large, the goal was to have an absolute majority of real citizens, people who fit the ethno-national definition. And this meant that some of the policies in establishing the State of Israel once the UN partition plan was announced was to, use terror, use intimidation, to displace Palestinians from their land and force them to leave the territory. And many did, of course.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I mean, perhaps you don't remember, but when I was, first coming into the field, the question was always, oh, there were Arab broadcasts that told Palestinians to leave. And then the new historians came about, and including the now in disrepute Benny Morris, whose book, for all its apologia that you find throughout its pages, basically documents, the hundreds and hundreds of villages that were destroyed, the acts of terror, the general, even though these were in some ways autonomous militias that came together under a general umbrella, they had the same, orders, the same, to dispossess and rid the Palestinian population. So, and of course, there's huge amount of fault in the UN, huge amount of fault with the British, who just, again quoting an acquaintance of mine, Raja Kumar, they cut and run. There's no supervision. They did the same thing, of course, we can't forget, in India at this time. Same year, partition, cut and run. Let the chips fall where they may. Thousands of people and thousands of people displaced, thousands of people killed in attacks and intercommunal violence. And in Britain, and in Palestine, that's exactly what happened. And it was maximalist. And by the time, the armistice came, they had basically dispossessed 75% of the population, forced them into exile, committed rapes, mass murder. Uh, there's a new book by Adam Raz that's been translated into English, again using Israeli sources, about the looting of the cities of the Palestinian middle classes, commercial classes, and these militia and ordinary Jewish future Israelis going into houses and just looting them, taking them over. And the scale of this dispossession, again, people have been calculating in various ways. At the time, I think the land alone, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.4 billion. But as you move that into more contemporary, bring it, up to date, you're talking about in the 60s. And I was trying to do a bit of calculation, at least, um, if not the same as Israel's GDP in the 60s, then sometimes much greater. And of course, if one includes usufruct and interest that could have been made, and I mean, it's just astounding the amount of money in a very parallel way to the way that the Turkish state relied on this mass expropriation of Armenians as a type of independence dowry.
Percentage-wise, probably more, in terms of, the
Well,
population and the land
in
and
terms of more,
such. But
because
it's very analogous.
they didn't take, they ended up with 87%, in the
Right.
end,
Yeah, yeah.
of the territory.
But it
So,
reminds me also very much of, like, what was happening in terms of what, Marx might have called primitive accumulation, but under colonialism, when
oh
people
yeah,
who have done the like analyses economically, there's a couple of wonderful Indian economists who have done a historical analysis of, how much the British stole from India, and it comes to
yeah,
22 or 23 trillion
yeah,
pounds. Yeah, and of course. So this is
yeah.
that these
But I
societies
think
were built on this hunger.
there's a genocide dividend that
Okay,
people,
let's hear. Yeah,
Ur Ungar, has documented in, and there's a number of people who've moved on, because before that, both Palestinians and Armenians have been concentrated on the human cost, the human
hmm.
dispossession. But
Right.
then you start looking at the economic side of it, and it's just truly astounding that these states wouldn't be anywhere near where they are
Yeah,
today without this wholesale looting
yeah. Oh, no, no, it's the
of
genius of
yeah.
these very industrious and brilliant and superior people, Ariel. That's what explains
Well,
a lot
no,
of
but
this stuff.
like how much, and my dear friend Norman Finkelstein made this point in the Holocaust industry. I mean, the people who actually suffered the trauma and the expropriation, and not just of, I mean, it's still going on. Finding out the Nazi stolen paintings, the
Yeah,
Nazi stolen wealth and stuff like that. Monies that squirreled away in Swiss banks, etc. But my family was never compensated for the small home that my great grandfather had in Slovakia, and someone just moved in. They just took it over. So there was no accounting at that level, and the majority of people who suffered and who lost, I mean, 6 million people, many of whom had no surviving relatives, never got any of those reparations. And instead, in the case of Israel and Germany, and that's a tie going to the post-war period too, is this reparation system that went directly to the state of Israel, and paid people like Norman's parents a pittance for their suffering in the Warsaw Ghetto,
right. So
and
you're
in the
saying that there were some
concentration camps.
major inputs, in economically speaking, into the building of the Israeli state and society that comes from both colonial expropriation and displacement, in the context of the state's founding, but then also as a result of the horrors and crimes of genocide in Europe, that instead of
Yeah,
compensating its actual victims, this
I mean,
nation state,
they got a certain
they get
percentage,
something, but yeah,
but
but there's been a
the
historic,
block grant was
yeah,
the
that's right.
wholesale transfer to the Israeli
That's
state.
right.
You know,
Well, I think you also have just to put some numbers and images and historical documentation to the point about the post war refugee crisis in Palestine from 47 to 49. You have a slide on that. That illustrates both the partition plan of the UN, but then also an interesting document here that I think lists the uh,
those are the
voting.
states, yeah,
Yeah,
voting,
and you
patterns.
did point out that there's a lot of blame to be assigned to the United Nations during this period, and let's remember that the United Nations of that day was not the United Nations of today. Most of the world still was suffering under colonialism, and it's only the decolonization processes of the 50s and 60s that, and into the 70s, that added new nations, from the global South, Africa, Asia,
Not to the hierarchy of the Security Council, but to the General
but to
Assembly.
the General Assembly. That's right. And at this point in time, the United Nations is composed principally of Western countries and Latin
Latin
American and
America,
South
yeah.
American countries that had gone through a process of those settler colonial republican revolutions, Bolivarian revolutions, in the 19th century. And some of them, later in the late 19th and early 20th century achieved their independence from, Britain and Spain and so on. And so those were the countries that populated the UN, and they did not have, and at this point in time, there are really very few Arab nations that have been enrolled into the UN system. Many
Yeah,
of them
but
are still
again, you
coming
should
out of the mandate.
read the commentary of the Syrians, for example. It's very instructive, and how clearly they saw what was going on. Europe has a refugee problem, and and they're going to put it on the backs of the Arabs and the Palestinians and betray us yet again. So yeah, that I mean, there was yeah. I'm not going
Well,
to.
I mentioned the decolonization processes that happen globally. I mean, how do you see that process working itself out in the regional context of the Middle East and the place now of this new settler colonial state being established in that post-war period?
Yes, this is the subject that I think we have to think about again in this multi-layered fashion, because on the one hand, you have in the post-war period with the weakening of these colonial states that whether they had been victors or vanquished during the war, now found themselves, strapped for cash, rebuilding, beholding to the United States, and so you have this process of decolonization that becomes successful with, of course, parts of the Middle East being some of the last parts of the world to be decolonized, whether it's countries in the Gulf or whether it's Algeria, which is a settler colonial state, which will have to go through a protracted war and counterinsurgency, brutal counterinsurgency. And so you have this moment, on the one hand, of a decolonization process that's sort of staggered throughout the region, um, with many of the former mandates now, states on their own, um, and part of the voting in that, including, well, Afghanistan is already there, but at the same time, in the immediate aftermath of the war, you get the Cold War. So, what's unique about the Palestine situation is that, yes, it's true that many states couldn't vote at this point; they weren't part of the League of Nations. I mean, the UN, but the communist bloc voted for Palestine. So it's this rare moment of unity, East and West, before the Cold War breaks out in earnest.
You mean
And
they
it
voted
was
for
they
the
voted
partition
for the
plan?
partition plan, and they also recognized the state of Israel, which was declared unilaterally in 1948. So the Soviet Union, part of the Eastern, yeah, as well as the United States. So I mean, we always focus on, and I think we predate the sort of unapologetic support of the United States back to this period when I think it was, a little more shaky than we acknowledge, and really didn't come into being into the same robust um, military sort of alignment until the 1970s, until after 67. Um, so there is that window in which Israel, as this new state, settler colonial state that has usurped lands, that has dispossessed hundreds of thousands of people who will find themselves in long term exile, um, eventually to be supported and helped by an organization that is actually um, a sort of built on the principle and the model of an organization that was created by the UN to help displaced persons, including Jews. And another version of it, which we now know under the acronym of UNRWA, will be developed in the aftermath as a sort of, band-aid over what had been done. And I'm not minimizing what they did, but that's where they start. We gave the Jews a state. We recognized the majority of it. They've dispossessed this people, and now we're going to create this humanitarian structure to help this, what started off as, 750,000 people, and now, of course, is 10 times that number who still live outside, who were made permanent refugees, right? So this moment in which two trends are happening: decolonization, recolonization, if you will, because that's what's happening in Palestine. So it's a new colonialism that's happening, and the Cold War is coming down. And it's at that moment that Israel strikes its own place in the region. And it does so, it defies international law because it will not let the refugees return. This is a cardinal rule of the Geneva Convention. And of course, it expropriates, which it has no right to do, private property, as well as what was left over from the Ottoman period is called state lands, which they now convert into under this heading of the Jewish National Fund and Jews only, for Jews only land, which they will now, in the present day, extend into East Jerusalem and elsewhere. So these two trends come into conflict with one another. And I think that's the framework that one has to look at the next 20 years of Palestinian history. How Palestine and the Palestinians become entangled in these Cold War conflicts, how the region becomes heavily militarized, and how individual states, even those that attempt to champion the Palestinian cause, are forced to make critical decisions whether to, deal with their own sovereignty, establish their own sovereignty, establish the means by which to feed large populations, to develop their country, and and or champion the Palestinians and find, as you have taught about, a third way, a non-aligned way to escape the vice of the Cold War. And inevitably, and I think that's part of the overview that one has to take on this region, these individual states, especially Egypt, Syria, the larger states, Turkey's in the mix but gets absorbed into NATO, Iraq, are forced to make that choice, and often at the expense of Palestinian autonomy and Palestinian rights. So.
Right. And, I think one part of the story here that you're mentioning about the kind of recolonization of the region via the Cold War is also the hostility towards any more regional approach of sovereign development, right? And what I'm thinking here is the way in which the region was fragmented in these new nation states that were faced with all kinds of immense post-colonial challenges after the Mandate period and achieving their political liberation as nation states, but that very structure also then presented certain challenges in being able to develop some kind of regionally coherent plan for development of sovereign decision and push them into this precarious and difficult situation of having to choose a camp if they needed finance for development projects. And of course, we think immediately of how all of this was embedded in the Nasserist program of Arab nationalism, maybe Arab socialism, but definitely a regional perspective that was anti-imperialist and but also at the same time, it was seeking support and finance for, projects that we might look back
Basic,
now and
yeah,
say, yeah,
basic
this wasn't
development
great.
projects.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
wasn't a great idea or approach, but this is what they wanted: energy generation. So they wanted to build this high Aswan Dam, and the financing for it, required expertise as well as investment. And so nationalizing the Suez Canal then becomes a major crisis, and we can see that during this period, Israel's role was as a kind of close ally to French and British attempts to reestablish predominant control in the region and recover, at least some kind of power and economic and geostrategic control over a key
Well, yeah, I
waterway,
mean,
shipping, through the Suez Canal.
this region, I don't think it's very difficult to compare it with any other region in the post-colonial world, because on one hand, it controlled much of the world's energy. On the other hand, in Egypt, it controlled the entire thoroughfare and highways of commerce through the Suez, right? So those two things made it the absolute one of the focal points of the Cold War. Um, and initially, and of course, and the resistance shown by the former colonial powers in lifting, in releasing those resources and that infrastructure, whether it was in Iran during the period of Mossadegh and the nationalization of oil, which was immediately clamped down on by the British with U.S. aid. And in the case of Egypt, which is a frontline state, Iran was not a frontline state to what was going on in the Palestine-Israel conflict. With respect to Egypt, basically Israel participated in this recolonization project by, in cahoots with the French and the British, staging an attack on Egypt, which would trigger a mutual defense clause, so that the British and the French could invade ostensibly to protect the Suez, right, under these previous agreements. So Israel at that moment also took a very definitive step, and perhaps one can debate, whether its leaders felt it was necessary, or for arms or whatever else, but it set itself on a particular path that it became this outpost of colonialism, and support for a vassal for the ongoing colonization of the region by taking that role. And it would continue that role through the 70s, when it became basically one of the bastions for the United States in the region, along with other key players, the Saudis, the Turks to some degree, of course, post Mossadegh Iran, but would also, reach out in its own direction, finding pariah states, yet unliberated, like South Africa, striking up very close relations, um, and developing these relationships, which continue to the present day with authoritarian states, whether it's arms sales, whether it's training, expertise, now surveillance, etc. So it set itself on a very particular path, and this was not peculiar to the Israeli right wing. This was mainstream policy. I mean, they continued relations with South Africa even after, all the other states in the world, and most of them had cut relations with South Africa because of its apartheid system. So I see from 56 a sort of policy platform in Israel, to align itself there. And of course, although the United States was not thrilled with what happened, I mean, it nearly triggered a direct conflict with the Soviet Union, and you know, Eisenhower wagged his fingers at, France and Britain, naughty, naughty, old world colonial powers. Um, but that became the trigger for the Eisenhower Doctrine in 57, of underscoring that this is an unstable region. We hope that they will become independent, responsible states, but as yet they're unstable. And of course, open the door to the hyper militarization of the region as these states were forced into this binary. They would continue, of course, to attend Bandung conferences, but the reality on the ground was either you got your arms from the United States or you got them from the Soviet Union, and they were mutually exclusive. Either you got your development technology from the Soviet Union or the United States. Either you educated your populations, in engineering and all these other technical skills in the Soviet Union, or you got, eventually Fulbright's United States, right?
Yeah,
But
Britain,
there was no,
UK, and yeah,
yeah,
UK and the US. Yeah.
there was no halfway measure. I mean, ironically, of course, I was in Afghanistan in the 70s, and I would meet people in the Afghan Communist Party who'd been trained in both countries, right, in the Soviet Union and in the United States. But that said, it basically created this dynamic within the region that submerged, not just entangled the Palestine question, but submerged it in, as you said, regional dynamics and global dynamics that superseded it. And it wasn't until the 60s when Palestinian organizations really emerged again to take the leadership in their own struggle. And of course, the most well known is Yasser Arafat and the PLO. The largest and eventually the most recognized and accepted of the Palestinian groups, although they spanned the spectrum and they had, by necessity, because they were stateless, relationships with different regimes in different parts of the Islamic world, particularly the Arab world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also, I mean, I think in that context, since you raised the question of decolonization and recolonization during this era, that and the way in which, especially after 56, Israel's political program was clearly integrated, not in the region as a state among other states, but as a kind of outpost of Western colonial and imperial dominance and hegemony, to break up and disrupt this region from, as I was mentioning, any kind of broader regional, transnational, international kind of program of independent and sovereign development that was being disrupted, by this. And so the counterpoint of that is that as that became so evident and obvious with its alignments with South Africa and with settler colonial regimes that were trying to hang on in Africa when the rest of the continent was undergoing struggles for decolonization and so forth, is that the PLO then became one of the symbolic and, you might say, causes of anti-colonial resistance, as sharing a kind of history with, the ANC, with other, movements fighting against Portuguese colonialism and so on. And so that's an important era, is this post 67, when Palestinians, instead of waiting, hopefully for Nasser to prove victorious in restoring, Palestinian rights and returning the refugees and so on, decide to struggle for their own liberation.
Yeah, before we move on to the post 67, because that is actually, that is very much a turning point for Palestinians themselves, but also for the entire region. I think we should also recall the fact that uh, that the foundation of the state of Israel, and the sort of immediate, posture of the Israelis during this time period, after the formation, has another set of collateral damage, and
Hmm.
that is all the Jewish communities
Hmm.
that exist in the
Yes.
Middle
Yes.
East.
Right.
And I mean, that is a huge tragedy for those countries which lost that kind of very important diversity, tragedies for the communities themselves, which still suffer, from that uprooting. There's a wonderful new book that I encourage everybody to read, is My Father's Paradise by Ariel Salzmann, about his father, who's one of the last speakers of Aramaic, I believe, in a small Kurdish village. And, I mean, so these, these communities were extinguished and then rebundled into Israel, where they were treated very poorly, um, and with the sort of disdain of a Ashkenazi, European, Euro-centered elite. But they also deprived the rest of the Middle East. We're beginning a process by which much of the Middle East would be rendered unrecognizable in terms of its cultural diversity and cosmopolitanism, a process that would continue with the wars and the US invasion, especially 2003 in Iraq. So that was another major collateral damage of the formation of an ethno-state in the heart of the Middle East, where Jews had lived, in harmony with their neighbors, from Morocco to, Yemen. Yemen, probably one of the not as good an example as of harmonious integration, but certainly Iraq and definitely Iran during these many, many centuries. So, but in the aftermath of 67, I think that's, the defeat of most of the Arab states by Israel is both, widely resonates in the region. It's a sense of hopelessness, of shame, but it's also a moment of opportunity for the Palestinians because, being stateless peoples, it's very difficult. I mean, the FLN in Algeria found that they had to base themselves in different places. So being stateless and trying to launch a type of armed conflict to recapture one's homeland is exceedingly difficult without getting submerged in the politics of the country you're living in. And it was that moment that first in Jordan and then in Lebanon, the Palestinian organizations come into their own and develop a sort of autonomy. Of course, what they do in order to commandeer the global stage is they engage in the same acts that the Israelis, that the future Israelis, that the Jewish militias engaged in Palestine. They engaged in anti-civilian acts and so-called acts of terrorism, of hijacking, and these things. And although one can say that these are acts against international law, one wonders what would have happened to the Palestinian cause were it not for these spectacular, although regretful incidents that occurred during this period and were part of this autonomy. And certainly, given the track record of Israel itself, with many of its most notorious terrorists moving on to becoming prime ministers of the state, was not inherently a disqualifying credential for leaders like Yasser Arafat. But I think when we talk about leadership, we can also talk about the flaws later on of organizations like the PLO and Yasser Arafat, which in many cases are a product of the circumstances in which these organizations mobilized, being cut off for after 67 from the largest Palestinian communities they were actually cut off from, and then after 82, being cut off from any sort of autonomy, being in Tunisia and trying to leverage some kind of political capital in order to gain the attention and the regard of the international community in a just cause.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's in that context, of course, of the early 80s, where the PLO leadership has been forced out of Lebanon and the camps of southern Lebanon. Of course, there had also been horrific massacres. The civil war in Lebanon was one that was complicated by the fact that many of the sectarian confessional divides were exploited by, outside powers alignments and so on. But there they are now in Tunisia, quite away from the occupied territories, from Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, where most of the refugees had gone to, but a popular kind of revolt, that actually proved probably, you were pointing out that it may have kept the cause of Palestine alive in that intervening period between 67 and, the mid 80s. To have the PLO and engaged in armed struggle. But in many ways, it's really resistance to the occupation of the popular base in the West Bank and Gaza that really starts to transform the political conditions, with the intifada, the first intifada, which was a popular youth resistance, to their occupiers, that was fundamentally peaceful in the sense that it was not based on armed struggle and through guerrilla warfare and so on, but through demonstrations, um, throwing stones at their occupiers, but as an act of defiance more than it was an act of military, strategy.
Yeah,
Uh,
mass protests,
Mass
mass
protests, yeah, and
demonstrations,
boycott and
boycotts.
many
Yeah,
other
and yeah, I
techniques.
mean the occupation, and some of the familiar figures who get put into the peace camp, like Yitzhak Rabin, were part of the people who designed the occupation, which was brutal. There was you were prevented from reading. There was lists of censored books. There was no ability whatsoever to express Palestinian national identity. In fact, the idea that Palestinians had a national identity, this very revolutionary concept, is still denied today in Israel. You can hear them, people talking in Israel. You can define where they are on the spectrum by the people who say Aravit and the people who say Palestinites, and they're divided. They still a core in Israel that will not accept Palestinian nationalism. And so, in this revolt, people are revolting against. They want to read books. They want to express themselves. They're not allowed to send up the colors of the Palestinian flags. That's sufficient to get arrested. And all these occupation forces was just totally brutal. I mean, people also don't realize that until 1960, the Palestinians who became Israeli citizens were under martial law until 1960. Were subject to, live fire and demonstrations in the 1970s, when they protest land expropriation. So this is a very brutal occupation, whether you're nominally Israeli because you have a passport and, were survivors of the Lod massacre and all these other massacres that occurred within the pre-67 borders of the state of Israel, or whether you're part of this new annex zone, and which has a very concentration of intellectuals and workers and farmers, and so there's an explosion in 1987 after states like Egypt and Jordan start this rapprochement with Israel and start agreeing to these so-called peace settlements, which I'll talk about in a subsequent episode, because they're peace without Palestine, peace without Palestinians. And so it's this in this moment, the PLO and the main representatives of the Palestinian people are silenced, confined in faraway place, where the Arab states, one by one, seem to be capitulating to the status quo. That you have this explosion from the people, completely, Gandhi-esque, passive resistance, and it is sustained despite horrific, oppression, jailing, torture, police, military repression until 1993. So about 87 to 93, 6 years, they sustained this. It's one of the remarkable acts of civil disobedience. I think that the first Intifada and it should be mentioned, the Great March of Return in 2018, 2019 are just stunning global examples of the will of people to resist overwhelming odds and overwhelming oppression, and their bravery and courage in the face of, utter complete brutality and dehumanization.
Well, I want to thank you for the discussion about this era from 48 basically, well, also the interwar period up to the start of the Oslo peace process, which will be the subject of our next episode.